Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. This is a video I've been wanting to film for a long time now, and recently someone asked me, what Kierkegaard book should I start with? So I thought this was the perfect time to go over my Kierkegaard collection and talk about which books I would recommend and just what you're going to expect coming into his work. I just want to mention that I am not someone with a background in philosophy. I'm very much a lay person, so to speak. I have studied the Stoics a little bit, some 19th century philosophy very, very lightly, early liberalism, that kind of thing. But I basically read Kierkegaard out of any kind of philosophical context. So it's not exactly ideal, but I did get a lot of value out of reading his work, and I continue to get value. So hopefully this will help people who just want to read him as more casual readers. So I misquoted myself on my blog. The first book I read by him was actually The Present Age on the Death of the Rebellion. This little book is really just a couple of essays. The first one is on the present age, or I should say, the present age, and then the second one is called Of the Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle. Okay, so I made the mistake of reading this at the airport. Probably not a good idea. I can't say it really left me with a huge impression, but I was certainly intrigued. The present age is, well, let me read the back. In his seminal 1846 tract, The Present Age, Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, analyzes the philosophical implications of a society dominated by mass media. So that's kind of the gist of the first essay. I did mark a few things. So here's a good quote. With every means in its power, reflection prevents people from realizing that both the individual and the age are thus imprisoned. Not imprisoned by tyrants or priests or nobles or the secret police, but by reflection itself. And it does so by maintaining the flattering and conceited notion that the possibility of reflection is far superior to a mere decision. And I thought that was just a really great way of kind of summing up the modern day. I mean, just kind of our whole political situation. It's kind of summed up by that. Same here. One man is curious about another. Everyone is undecided, and their way of escape is to say that someone must come who will do something, and then they will bet on him. Like, we're always looking for a superhero to solve our problems, rather than each of us individually or even as collectives of individuals trying to solve the problem. So, super great insights there. I also enjoyed this last essay quite a bit, of the difference between a genius and an apostle. One thing he really drove home in this little essay was this idea of accepting something based on authority versus supposed profoundness of what is being said. So here he's talking about eternal life, and he said, the decisive thing is not the statement, but the fact that it was Christ who said it. But the confusing thing is that as though in order to tempt people to believe, they talk about profundity. In order to speak correctly, a Christian priest would have to say quite simply, we have Christ's word for it that there is eternal life, and that settles the matter. There is no question here of racking one's brains or philosophizing, but simply that Christ said it. Not as a profound thinker, but with divine authority. So yeah, what I really love about Kierkegaard is he's very, very brilliant, but he does write from the perspective of someone who is kind of working things out in his mind. He's not prescribing a way for you to live. It's more about just, his thought process. And I love writers like that. So before we move on, let me talk briefly about his life, because I think it's important that we kind of understand who he is before reading his books. Kierkegaard was not a pastor or a priest. He was a guy who lived back in the early 1800s. He was born in 1813, and by the time he was 30, he had lost most of his family to sickness, and he had lost his fiancée, Regina. He broke off his engagement with her, actually. So when he talks about tragedy and faith and despair and anxiety, he really knows those things from the heart. They're not just generalizations or hypotheses. So there's this very personal element that runs throughout his work, and I think that's something that definitely resonates with me. The next book I read after The Present Age was Fear and Trembling. I didn't actually read this version. I read the Penguin Classics version. But this is about Abraham being asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. And it's a very familiar story for those of us who've grown up with it, but I found it to be really, really good. He basically takes it apart verse by verse and kind of builds up this picture of Abraham as this, quote, knight of faith. And the fact that everything Abraham did was based on the, quote, strength of the absurd. So what he's trying to show you is this picture of faith as something outside of, apart from, and higher than mere human logic and understanding. And sometimes it reaches the point where it appears foolish to the rest of the world. And there's a biblical basis for this. In Corinthians, it says, "The natural man receives not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him." And so, kind of revisiting this story as an adult was really intriguing. I didn't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions, but it certainly inspired me to read more of his work. Works of Love is a book I read in 2015, and it honestly just blew me away. This is my favorite book after the Bible, honestly. One of Soren Kierkegaard's most important writings, Works of Love, is a profound examination of the human heart, in which the great philosopher conducts the reader into the inmost secrets of love. Deep within every man there lies the dread of being alone in the world, forgotten by God, overlooked among the household of millions upon millions. So what is this book? Again, he kind of follows his typical format, which is to take a verse and kind of look at it piece by piece, almost taking it apart mathematically, as it were. So part 1 is focused on the verse, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so he talks about, what does it mean, you shall love your neighbor, you shall love your neighbor. And, really looking at it from all these different angles. Like our duty to love those we see, our duty to be in the debt of love to each other. And he's not just talking about, obviously, romantic love or platonic love. Actually, though, he kind of talks about love as this holistic thing. Like, he doesn't really break it apart like some other authors have. I've read books on love by Eric Fromm and C.S. Lewis. Kierkegaard definitely takes sort of this, again, very broad approach to it. In part 2, he goes over some other verses. Love builds up, love believes all things and yet is never deceived. Love hopes all things and yet is never put to shame, and so on. I'll just read some things I marked from it. As you can see, I just loved this book. And another thing that is great about it is that not only is it holistic in terms of love, but also in application. So, for example, he talks about law. Alas, we often think that freedom exists and that it is law which binds freedom. Yet it is just the opposite. Without law, freedom does not exist at all, and it is law which gives freedom. We also think that it is law which makes distinctions, because where there is no law, there is no distinction. Yet it is just the opposite. When it is law which makes distinctions, it is in fact the law which makes everyone equal before the law. Thus, Christianity always has consolation, and its consolation is different from all human consolation, in that human consolation recognizes itself to be a substitute for lost joy, and Christian consolation is joy itself. Yeah, so again, going back to the concept of loving your neighbor, and he has this whole section. I mean, as you can see, he doesn't really favor paragraphs here, but this whole section about why love your neighbor. And his thesis here is that, well, your neighbor is always going to be near you. In other words, a neighbor is not someone like a brother, a sister, a mother, a father. It's going to be just the nearest person to you, and so it is more of a role rather than a specific person, if you will. No change can take your neighbor from you, for it is not your neighbor who holds you fast. It is your love which holds your neighbor fast. If your love for your neighbor remains unchanged, then your neighbor also remains unchanged, just by being. Death itself cannot deprive you of your neighbor either, for if it takes one, life immediately gives you another. I mean, these again are very familiar verses, but for people that, grew up with it and are coming back to it as adults, it's really excellent for re-solidifying the meaning of these things in your heart. Is morality an accidental matter, so that when a great number do wrong, or we all do it, wrong is then right? This explanation would only be a repetition of mutinous thought, or mutinous thoughtlessness, for if it is men instead of God who ultimately decide what the law's demand is, the one who forgets God's law is not only personally guilty of insurrection against God, but he is also a contributor to the success of the mutiny. Okay, so one of my huge takeaways from this book was the concept that God is the center of all your relationships. And before this, I had kind of thought of it, well, there's me and there's this other person or people, and God is kind of in the background or overhead. And, as long as I'm honest with these people and, I'm following God's commandments, then, the relationship is going to be godly. But this is a little bit different. He's saying God is directly in your relationship. He is the middle person. And when you interact with someone, when you love someone, you're going through God, so to speak. He's in the middle. First it goes through him and then to that person. That was kind of a really different way of thinking about it for me, and it just changed my life, honestly, and the way I viewed relationships after that. So that's excellent. Actually, I forgot to read this excerpt here. The world can never go... No, let me back up. The distinction which the world makes is namely this. If a person wants to be all by himself in being selfish, which after all is very rarely seen, the world calls it selfishness. But if in selfishness he wants to form a group with several other selfish people, especially with many other selfish people, the world calls it love. The world can never go any further in characterizing what love is because it has neither God nor one's neighbor as a middle term. What the world honors and loves under the name of love is group selfishness. And that is really true. We live in a very virtue signaling culture, and that is exactly what he's talking about here. So, I mean, really, nothing actually changes. These are things he noticed in his own society in Denmark back in the early 1800s, but very relevant to today. Our duty to love those we see. Would it not be sadder still and still more confusing if love also should be only a curse because its demand could only make it evident that none of us is worth loving, instead of love's being recognized precisely by its loving enough to be able to find some lovableness in all of us, consequently loving enough to be able to love all of us. So, there's a lot on that as well. So he goes into the story of Peter's denial of Christ when Christ was arrested, and just really highlights that whole story. Christ's love for Peter was so boundless that in loving Peter, he accomplished loving the person one sees. He did not say, Peter must change first and become another man before I can love him again. No, just the opposite. He said, Peter is Peter and I love him. Love, if anything, will help him to become another man. So, yeah, Christ's forgiveness of Peter is one of those stories that he, very familiar, but he gives it another angle that is just really, really helpful. So yeah, I won't spoil the rest of the book for you. As you can see, there's just so much gold in this book, and it's one of the more readable of his works. So you could actually probably start with this one. I would probably recommend starting with Fear and Trembling, but this is probably something you can start with as well. I read the Howard and Edna Hong translation, so check that out for sure. So more recently, I read The Concept of Anxiety, a simple psychologically oriented deliberation and view of the dogmatic problem of hereditary sin. Yeah, this book is dense, honestly. It is. And by dense, I mean just the text is really heavy. I barely understood it. What he's really kind of talking about in here... Okay, so let me back up a little bit. I don't really have that philosophical background to understand what he's talking about in some of these books, and this is one of those. I understand that this is basically the second half of a conversation with the philosopher Hegel, and I've never read Hegel, so I don't really know what all he's getting at here. But a couple things did jump out to me in this book. He talks about free will being anxiety because we have this tension inside of ourselves that, we could sin. And so that's kind of just something that's part of us because we have free will. That was the main thing I got from this, honestly, but people with more background probably would find it more interesting. Most recently, I read Spiritual Writings, which is an anthology of his religious essays, and they're kind of grouped into these different themes. So the first one is the gift. Every good and every perfect gift is from above. The second one is creation, what we learn from the lilies and the birds. So, don't worry about tomorrow and just trust that God will provide for you. And then the last part is love at the feet of the Savior, the woman who anointed Jesus' feet with perfume. And I really thought this was a very uplifting and insightful book too. It's a little harder to read than Works of Love, mostly because it's a bit repetitive. Each essay kind of says the same thing as the previous one. He just looks at it from a slightly different angle. So it's repetitive, but it's excellent, honestly. I was going through some stuff when I read this, and it just gave me such a wonderfully refreshing perspective. For example, he talks about the story of Job and how Job thanked God even though God had taken away, his blessings. So the theme here is to thank God no matter what your situation is. Again, coming from someone who lost most of his family, that's just really, really profound. Be satisfied with being human. That was a really good chapter. He has this wonderful parable about the lily and a bird. So the bird comes to the anxious lily and says, there's a lily in another field over here that's much prettier than you. And then the lily starts to worry and get super anxious. It's kind of a cute fairy tale, but on a deeper level, it's kind of poignant. So the one thing that really struck me while reading this was the anxieties we invent ourselves. So in this chapter, again, talking about not worrying about tomorrow. And really, that's one of the most difficult commandments for anybody to follow. I mean, we all have our personal worries. We have worries about the future and just society in general. But he talks about the fact that, Christ pretty much uniquely, all his life he knew how he was going to die and what his future held for him. And yet, he bore that so bravely and without complaining. And, he did not suffer as human beings suffer, who, when beset by adversity and tribulation, can always believe that it might all still turn out for the best, for he knew that what lay ahead was unavoidable. He knew that every sacrifice he made in the cause of truth only hastened his persecution, and in the end, and he therefore held his fate in his own hands. That's something I never really thought about before, but it's true, and that gave me a lot of encouragement. So if you're someone who's going through some anxiety or just need some encouragement, I think this is a great book. Maybe don't read it straight through, just read sections of it. I actually started with the last section and worked my way backwards, but yeah, this is an excellent book. I just want to back up a little bit and mention that I am reading The Sickness Unto Death currently. This book is like a little harder to read than this book, but not quite as hard as this book. But I am enjoying it. Again, I really appreciate his sort of gradual, kind of rambling, yet thought-provoking style. If you read it slowly, you can just get a lot from it, and you'll come across, gems like, when the danger is so great that death has become one's hope, despair is the disconsolateness of not being able to die. So, he just drops these gems as you're reading, and it's just wonderful. So I am looking forward to finishing this one. And I will probably also reread The Present Age, which we talked about earlier, and do a review of that on the blog. So I think that's all I have. Let me know if you read Kierkegaard, what you think. What were your favorite books by him? I know there's a few more I haven't come across yet. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.